First, let me thank Professor Said Akhtar Hussain and for his very generous and unexpected invitation, which I don't feel worthy of, because confronted with such scholars of Iqbal in particular and of Persian and Urdu literature in general, I do not consider myself to have any authority to say anything that can be useful, but however, I will refer to some of my memories and some of my reflections to try to put a few questions and perhaps help shape a few answers, which I hope will be useful to the following proceedings. So, Professor Hussain, Professor Minoucher, Professor Mortazavi Hassel, and Professor Ashraf Khan. Ladies and gentlemen, first, I should say that when I learned about Iqbal, it was through my father's acquaintance with Louis Massignon, the great French Islamologist and Arabicist, who had, in fact, he was more of an Arabicist than a Persianist, than an Iranologue, as we say in French. So his knowledge of Iqbal was somewhat derivative, but he, of course, highlighted his importance, which was not acknowledged so much in the Francophone world. Then later on, of course, I had the good fortune of spending a couple of years at the Indian Institute of Islamic Studies, Hamdard Nagar, with our friends, the late Asaf Ali and the late Hakim Abdul Hamid and their faculty. And there I was able to read a lot of Iqbal's, unfortunately, for me, myself, of course, in English translation, since my Persian is simply not sufficient, not up to the task. And of course, I was very interested in the context of history, and also in the context of philosophy in his work, because at that time I was very, very young, I was working on a history of what I call Islamic cosmosophy, the medieval Islamic venture to bring together scientific data of the time with mystical philosophy. Neoplatonic, Aristotelian, and what ensued. And of course, one of the books I referred to was his thesis at the König Maximilian Universität in Munich, which was his thesis on the development of Persian metaphysics. And it's interesting that as he was throughout his life, he is very comprehensive because he goes all the way back to Zoroastrianism and he ends with Baha'ism, if I remember right, which of course nowadays would perhaps not be regarded as an actual Islamic philosophy, but then again he was talking about Persian metaphysics. And it's interesting that the reflections he makes at the outset are that Persians are not really very patient with details and with organization, and they prefer to let the mystical vein flow, which he says is not exactly consonant with the German and the European approach to philosophy and even metaphysics, which is very systematic and codified. So here already you can see the unease that he experiences, torn as he is between two cultures, which he's trying to assimilate and bring together, because very clearly he is inspired by a number of European philosophers. Generally, you hear that his primary, you might say, source of inspiration, apart from Goethe, who has already been mentioned, also Nietzsche, very important influence, especially on his interpretation of the Walaya, which I think in his mind becomes a bit of the mystical equivalent of the Übermensch, the Nietzschean Übermensch. And then there is also the influence of Bergson, l'élan vital, and several other things, which you find in his definition of the self as well. And I also would say that Schopenhauer played a big role because of Schopenhauer's early interest in the will, the will as creation of reality, as it were, and through ideas. So you can see, of course, through that the heritage of Plato, and all that is not really his poetry, which is the main subject of this seminar. But then his poetry is highly philosophical most of the time, and his poetry does refer to Platonic as well as typically Sufi concepts. And you can, of course, see a lot of philosophy, also politics. They say that poetry and politics are somewhat combustible as a mixture. And we have a few examples of great poets who have become the mentors of revolutionary movements and new nation states. I can see, or at least new constitutions. I can see that Iqbal is one of them, Iqbal is one of them. Another one is Victor Hugo and the French Third Republic. And another one is probably D'Annunzio and the takeover of Italy by Mussolini and his movement. And another one, of course, is Maxim Gorky and the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik Revolution. So in all these four cases, I would also say, of course, Tagore and the Indian independence movement. Although, like Iqbal, Tagore had very evolving and very unsystematic approach to nationhood and nationality, in the sense that, as we can see, in Tagore, there is a yearning for universality and the distrust of nationalism. And in Iqbal, we have this conflict which appears throughout his work between, Milli, Watan, and Ummah. And I think the three are not necessarily reconciled throughout his work, because if you compare his Taranai Hind and then his Taranai Milli, you can see the difference. And then again, you can see these questions which are asked, like, for example, the fact that Sare Jahan Hamara Watan, yes, which is again, something which has to be pondered in the sense, is he referring to the universality of man, or is he referring to the universality of the faith? And that's probably what eventually brought him apart essentially from the Indian National Congress and the Indian independence movement, because we know that he probably is the first one who uttered the sentence that Congress is Hindu Raj. And Jinnah took that from him. And Jinnah, coming from a very skeptical, even agnostic background, was eventually brought, probably for rather, I would say, opportunistic reasons, into this concept of a separate Muslim nation with a Muslim state by Iqbal. And we know that Iqbal played a big role in encouraging him to take the leadership of the Muslim League, to develop the Aligarh movement into an actual political structure which could lead to the birth of a new nation. But again, if you look at, and here I'm drifting a bit away from the poetry, but if you look at his concept of the political structures he foresaw, you could see that he had this vision of very autonomous provinces, which would, of course, have, in the case of the Northwest and of Bengal, Muslim governments and Muslim societies. But at the same time, he was also not sure whether the British Raj would vanish, or if it were to stay, like many leaders of the Congress thought it might for a very long time, then of course how to achieve full regional independence under some sort of crown protectorate. All these ideas appear very, very outdated now, but they clearly were very much present in people's minds in the 1920s and 1930s. And I would of course also refer to his discussion about the meaning of nation and nations with Ambedkar. Because, as you know, he argued that India was made up of several nations, and that Islam, or Muslims essentially, were one nation. And again, here Ambedkar probably agreed with him, because Ambedkar also thought of a Dalit nation. So you can see that in the formation of India and Pakistan, there were these conflicting ideas about nationhood as opposed to a common cultural identity, and then again, what makes culture? Is it religion, or is it something else? And I'm very intrigued by the change in Iqbal between 1904, when he, if I remember right, wrote the Taranai Hind, and then 1908, when he comes back and he becomes a convinced, what you might call Muslim nationalist, although I'm not so sure. When he talked about the Ummah and wanted this close cooperation between India, Iran, Afghanistan, whether he actually meant some sort of a confederation, or whether he meant a revival of the caliphate in a new form. Many of the dreams we have tend to take shape in ways that we had not anticipated and probably would not approve of. For example, what happened after independence was that fairly soon Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey were united under the US influence in the Pact of Baghdad, which was certainly not what Iqbal would have thought about, or at least desired. But this is the way part of his vision seemed to materialize, and it only lasted for a few years, then it sort of broke apart. Now, back to what happened in 1908, there is no doubt that in his vision of a Muslim nation, the Western concept of nation was very influential. That's why after spending 4 years in Europe, 3 years in Europe, he probably imbibed the concept, very prevalent at the time, of national states, defined by religion and culture and language. Of course, the influence of Persian and Urdu here is fundamental in his idea of a Muslim nation. But he made some very interesting reflections about what in his view was wrong with Europe. And I must say I have trouble following him, because he says, for example, and he said that later, he said that in, I think, 1919, that back in 1907, he had thought that what was wrong with Europe and what would create a major European disaster, which in fact he saw in World War I, was the separation of church and state, of religion and state. He said not only is democracy a dangerous product, but the separation of church and state leads to the destruction of morality and eventually to the corruption of public life, and then you get eventually the collapse of a society, which he predicted for the West. Now, imagine him thinking of that in 1907, when he was studying in very devout Bavaria, ruled by a Catholic monarchy with a really dominant church, and in Germany, where the Emperor Kaiser II, Wilhelm II, used to preach every Sunday the Protestant gospel in church as a head of state, and where Britain was ruled by a queen who obviously was the head of the church. I mean, the only state that was not ruled by the church and where separation between church and state was real, but only since 1905, was France. So it's very interesting that in Iqbal's mind, the European states had already become secular or even agnostic states, or laïc states, you know, not at all religious, when in fact it wasn't the case politically, you know. So what did he mean? And I think what happened, what he actually intended to say, and he actually spelled that out, is that there is a difference between Christianity and Islam, because Christianity is based on give Caesar what is unto Caesar, and give to God what is unto God, what is given to God what is God's, which he says does not exist in Islam. Islam is an all-encompassing system which regulates politics, economics, social relations, culture, and so on. And therefore, that is why he said Islamic societies, Muslim societies could never or should never follow the Western path of separating the religion from the state, because he saw in Europe the more or less harmonious or disharmonious consensus or synthesis between a Roman state and a Semitic Judeo-Christian tradition. And he felt that was not the case of Islamic countries, which were ruled by a, what you might call a purely Semitic creed, which he extolled in his you know, the poem about the Hejaz, the message from the Hejaz. Now, I would like to also, I cannot talk about Iqbal without emphasizing his Kashmiri heritage and his very present Kashmiri Brahmin ancestry. And to my mind, that makes him one of the people in the subcontinent who carried this very complex mixed legacy, which you also find in Jawaharlal Nehru and in, among eminent Kashmiris, of course, Sheikh Abdullah and his family, in which you have these three layers, you know, the Kashmiriyat, the Muslim identity, and of course the Hindu heritage, and how they combine and are able to bring those together or not bring them together. I mean, it's very interesting that Nehru wrote that he did not feel himself to be a Hindu, you know, that he acknowledged the cultural heritage and the greatness of the civilization, but that he didn't really identify with Hinduism as such. So that in itself is a very interesting reflection, because it shows that just like Iqbal could not identify with the concept of India as Hindudom, as a sort of a mixed civilization with religions living side by side, because in his mind Islam could not be compromised, could not submit to the rule of non-Muslims. And at the same time, you see that there has been in Kashmir this very, very painful and tormented evolution, which India and the world are still dealing with, apart from Kashmiris themselves. So, you know, this is something which, to my mind, should attract further investigation and analysis. And as far as I'm concerned, perhaps I would like to leave you, because I haven't really done much honor to Iqbal's poetry, but I don't think that is my talent either, because poetry is something you have to appreciate in its own language. And if you're not conversant enough with the languages in which a poet writes, then you should probably not be able to give a very authoritative opinion about it. But still, I would like to say that one of the great things that, of course, Iqbal has left us is the Javelnama, which is inspired by Dante's Divina Commedia, the concept of the guide that takes you through the various stages. But at the same time, here we should also be aware that the Divina Commedia itself is a very orientalizing epic. In fact, one of the great Spanish Islamologists has traced it to a similar poem written in the 13th or 14th century by a poet called Ibn Rundi, who was from Andalusia. And of course, you can trace in Rundi the influence of both Zoroastrianism and of Platonic metaphysics, because the concept of the guide is present, as it is in a lot of Persian philosophical literature. But here, of course, you have Iqbal creating a synthesis again between Eastern and Western concepts. And clearly his vision was one of an evolving, modernized, somewhat scientifically influenced Islam, because clearly he was concerned about and hostile to rigidity. He wanted culture, religion, human thought to evolve and constantly imbibe new trends and new ideas from all over the world. And this is, of course, perhaps what we should remember most about Iqbal, that in his poetry as well as in his philosophy, he does essentially point us towards a global future, and he sees himself as a global thinker. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen,